So Grant, thank you so much for being a guest on my podcast, Therapy for Guys. I'm super excited about discussing your book and more importantly, getting to know you as a person and understanding kind of how this book came into being. And that's kind of where I wanted to start. Like, could you just begin by maybe giving the audience a little bit about yourself? And then maybe we can go backwards and kind of explore how the book came to be.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a philosopher, and I came to philosophy through a somewhat circuitous route.
Okay.
I actually did my PhD in English at the City University of New York's Graduate Center, um, and that was I started that in 2004, and I about 2 to 3 years into my program, I realized that I was taking every theory class available, and most of the things we were reading were French philosophy, like
Sure.
Derrida and Foucault, some Donna Haraway, things like that. And then also I was taking classes with a scholar of the James brothers, so William James and Henry James,
Yeah.
um, and and I loved Henry James. We read some Bergson. We read Bergson's Creative Evolution in that course, and so that was really uh, what got me deeply into philosophy was, I think, probably that course, that a few other things as well. And but I'd already finished my coursework pretty much by the time I realized that I was enjoying the philosophy more than the
Sure.
actual literature. Although I do love literature, uh, and so I just made the choice to stick with it because honestly I was looking around at various philosophy programs around New York City where I was living, and most of the programs there, especially at the time, I think it's changed a little bit now, but at the
Okay.
time they were almost exclusively analytic philosophy,
Mm,
um, which is it's very logic based and it's very analytical and very rationalist,
right.
and I'm much more interested in sort of the continental what's called continental philosophy, which is sort of it's more literary, it's more psychological, um, and it's more experimental. It's just in general, I think it's a lot more fun and, and interesting.
Yes, me too.
It's focused. So
It seems a lot more creative, although I'm sure the analytic
uh,
guys wouldn't appreciate that, but
right, yeah, yeah. I mean, to me, there's some good analytic philosophy, and I
sure.
appreciate, like, Thomas Nagel, and um, especially among analytic philosophers. I guess Charles Taylor is sort of an analytic philosopher. I like him. But it definitely tends to be more what I would describe as logic studies than what has
Sure.
traditionally been considered philosophy, which is, goes back to, Plato and Socrates, and I mean these guys are thinking about the big questions of existence,
Yes.
and it's as much imaginative as it is rationalist and logical. So
Sure, sure.
yeah.
Well, can you, okay, so going back just a little bit, how did you get to the point where, going to graduate school was something that you wanted to pursue? Can you speak to, maybe in your childhood, what were some of the formative sort of either experiences or what was it an environment where education was valued and where ideas kind of exchanged? I'm just curious to get to know you at that level. What kind of
Sure.
led you to, yeah, I think that graduate school was a good idea.
uh, Well, so I grew up with um, I grew up in Northern California with
Okay.
parents who were deeply interested. They're old hippies who became, went into business. My dad is a musician, and my
Nice.
mom's a writer, and she
Okay.
actually in her 50s got her PhD in religion.
Oh, wow.
And so I sort of watched her going through that while I was in high school and college. And she's actually the one who I think first introduced me to Jung in particular, and also to Alfred North Whitehead.
Mm.
And so it just seemed it was sort of it's almost like the family business in a way. So I had a leg up in that sense education was really supported and really valued in my family.
Yeah,
And my parents were always I know that the podcast is called Therapy for Guys,
sure.
and my parents were always really positive about therapy. They considered it, especially my mom is, she considered it almost like this the level of just going to see a priest or a rabbi
Got you.
an advisor or something. It's a very normal, healthy thing to do, which I think there's often I'm sure you've encountered this, that there can sometimes be a stigma against
Absolutely.
therapy, especially among men.
Yes.
And but I grew up thinking that therapy is a healthy thing that everyone should do, that everyone
Mm,
should learn how to um, see the things that are unconsciously motivating them and become aware of those drives and impulses and narratives um, that are motivating us on profound levels.
sure.
Um, so I grew up in that context, and then
Can I ask you this about
yeah,
that? Oh, in terms
sure.
of growing up in that context, sounds like with parents that were involved in some of these things, what was there any type of and I know the word is kind of debated these days, but was there any kind of spirituality or religious kind of context that
Yeah,
kind of shaped you or formed you?
definitely. My mom's a very, very spiritual person,
Okay.
which I think a lot of people rebel against sort of more conventional forms of religion. But
Right.
my rebellion is against sort of kind of hippie, almost new age
Yeah.
spirituality. Although I've come back around to appreciating a lot of elements of it. But I'm very keen um, to differentiate my interest in Jungian thought from sort of the more um, you know I guess popular or less sophisticated versions of of his work, or
And that's one
people
thing I
who have sort of
really enjoyed about
appropriated
your
his work.
book, which
Oh,
which
thank
maybe
you.
we can get into in a little bit. But so okay, so yeah, so you kind of rebelled a little bit against kind of the new agey spirituality.
uh,
Um, what was there a certain tradition or a certain kind of flavor of that you kind of grew up with? Like I'm just curious, maybe what your mom was into.
right. Well, so my mom's Jewish, and my dad is grew up vaguely Episcopalian.
Okay.
Although we actually found out just a few years ago that my dad is actually also 1/8 Jewish, which we never knew that.
Oh wow.
Um,
Was that like
and
the
so
23 and Me or something?
yeah, we did it. Yeah, through 23andMe. And so I was raised sort of, you know, kind of culturally very, very, in a very liberal Jewish kind of way.
Sure.
But my mom was already always very interested in Buddhism and in the I Ching, um, and in Eastern spirituality. And my dad was actually really interested in shamanism for a while. So
Yeah.
it's like this is sort of like the milieu that I came up in. And so I, I moved to New York, almost drawn by the sort of that very like sort of skeptical postmodern uh, quality that kind of permeates New York City. And
Oh
then I
yeah.
proceeded, and then I proceeded to be really into Jung and into Jungians like Hillman within this very skeptical sort of postmodern milieu in New York. So it's like I always have this tendency to want to push against whatever milieu I'm in.
Got
Um,
you. I have the
so
same thing.
yeah, yeah. It's I think it's sort of common among people who like to problematize and question assumptions and things of that nature.
Sure. Yeah, no, and I feel like the more rigid the group around me gets, yeah, the more I want to kind of point out, okay, here are the issues with that, or here's the other side, and then I can move in that direction, and then I want to kind of come back. So I'm always going back and forth. I never kind of land in one spot, and I don't know what that's about necessarily, but
There's probably something archetypal going on there. There's some
there you
like
go.
Promethean urge to to disrupt and transform whatever the situation you're currently inhabiting.
Yes, yes.
I
Now,
definitely resonate with that.
absolutely. I know one of the questions I wanted to ask you, and you've kind of explored this in other episodes, other podcasts you've been on, which I've really enjoyed listening to.
Oh,
You
thank you.
you at some point come across the work of Richard Tarnas.
Yeah. So when I was in undergrad in Austin, Texas,
Oh,
Um,
okay. So you went to UT?
yeah, yeah.
Nice.
Are you in
I'm
Texas?
I'm
Is
in
that
I'm in the Houston, Texas area. Yeah.
Houston? That's
I
right.
my,
Okay.
my father went to UT. I work with a lot of students that are either
Very good.
in U at UT or that are going there. So yeah, it's a great school.
Yeah, it is. I was there for 5 years, and
Okay.
I loved Austin.
Austin's great.
Mm. So I think it was maybe the summer between my maybe freshman and sophomore year. I was working at a bookstore,
Hmm.
um, just for the summer, and it was half price books.
Oh my God, I love half price books.
Yeah,
It's tragic that they've closed some of the big ones here in Houston, but there's still a couple left.
yeah, yeah. It was great. And so I was just shelving books, and I was shelving in the philosophy section,
Yeah,
and I think I had taken one philosophy course at that point in undergrad, and I just hadn't found it very inspiring. I guess I just didn't resonate with the professor.
mhm.
And I was actually really resonating much more with this one English professor in particular who he ended up becoming the head of the English department at Yeshiva University in New York. His name is Adam Zachary Newton. He's just this brilliant literary theorist.
Mm,
So he was thinking in a very philosophical way about literary texts. Um, that's sort of why I think a large part of why I went into English is because it was the modes of interpretation instead of the actual literary texts themselves, which I mean, I always have to say that I do love literary texts, but it's not
sure.
my my primary um, my primary interest. But Tarnas, I was shelving books and I came across this book called The Passion of the Western Mind.
Mm,
Um, and it looked interesting. The cover was just very evocative, and so I just started reading the back, and I think I bought the book and took it home and read it, and it was uh, I just it's a really good introduction to the history of Western thought, um, and particularly the concept of the forms or archetypes. And so he
mm.
traces this idea from the ancient Greeks and the Hebrews up through the 20th century. And so I read that book. I actually read that book I think a couple times, and that's what initially got me interested in philosophy. Although
Okay,
I wasn't yet envisioning myself as a philosopher. That it took a few years before I would sort of make that turn.
sure.
Um, and and then so then I reread that book when I was in New York, and so that was I think that was in the late '90s, and then in the early 2000s I was like mid 2000s. I was when I was in grad school. I was reading Derrida and Foucault, and I you know I felt an affinity, especially with Derrida, um, but the negative affective tone of his work. I mean, his
Mm.
and just the conceptual negativity.
Of like
I
deconstruction.
yeah, deconstruction. I wanted. I just found myself constantly wanting to argue with it, but I thought he was brilliant, and I thought his style was brilliant, and I thought there was something really important and evocative going on there. So I really engaged with his work for a while.
Sure.
Um, but but that's when I was looking for something to sort of counteract that negativity, which I later learned was um, expressed by Schelling, the the German philosopher from the 18th and 19th century,
Sure.
as a he has this distinction between negative and positive philosophy, and so I see Derrida as the the peak expression of negative philosophy, and it
Okay.
is affectively negative, but it's critical, it's problematizing, it it disrupts and destabilizes whatever text it's reading or whatever modes of thought it's examining. And at that moment, I was looking for a more generative um, narrative that could offer some kind of explanation for what is going on in this complex, chaotic world that we live in. And so, and so I reread Rick Tarnas's work, and
Mm,
it was it's a great book. It's especially if you're just getting into philosophy. It's definitely more of a popular work, and at this point, I think I don't agree with everything he says in that book. although I still deeply admire him in a lot of ways.
Sure.
Um, but so I got into that book, and then I actually wrote him, and he
Mm.
wrote me back, and we started corresponding. Um, and he was very kind and very generous with his time, and we formed a sort of friendship, and he was sort of mentoring me as I was going through my my graduate program.
Wow.
And I flew out to California and did some intensives with him, some courses, and met with him and his students. And he teaches at the California Institute of Integral Studies, which is in San Francisco.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah,
Is that Ken Wilber's institution, or he was
no,
no?
no. It's integral, but it was based on the work of Aurobindo, Sri Aurobindo, um,
Oh,
in
okay.
the Indian philosopher.
Yeah, I'm only aware of that because I read this book by Jeffrey Kripal where
Mm,
it maps out the history of Esalen
right.
and
Yeah.
Big Sur. Okay, and
Yeah.
kind of like an evolutionary approach to spirituality.
Right. Yeah, Rick Tarnas was the director of programs at Esalen before he started the philosophy department at CIIS,
Okay, got you.
in like the 70s and 80s, I think. That's when he
Okay. Oh,
was at
very
Esalen.
cool.
Yeah. Um, so so that was great, and he and then I you know discovered his book Cosmos and Psyche, which is a whole other conversation that maybe we
I
can get
actually wanted to
into.
ask because that's the one that I've read. I haven't read the whole thing because I think I mentioned when we were messaging. I have a very good friend, Patrick McGrath Moniz, who's a professional artist and
Right, right. Oh
really
yeah.
wanted me to read this book, Cosmos and Psyche, because at one point in his life, he was into kind of astrology, which I really don't know much about. But
Hmm.
one of the big ideas I got out of that book is, the psyche isn't just contained, in our body, so to speak, or in some kind of internal world, but the psyche is maybe outside as well. That you can't necessarily separate psyche and matter. And that was
Hmm.
just a really interesting idea that I'm still trying to kind of make sense of and work out. But do you think about those matters?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, what I'm really focusing on these days is finding parallels between. I mean, I think Tarnas, he was a student of James Hillman,
Yeah.
or I guess I don't know if he ever formally took courses with him, but they had sort of developed a friendship and a mentor-mentee relationship, and Hillman was actually in analysis with Jung in Zurich, and Hillman actually became sort of the director of programs at the Jung Institute in Zurich. So Rick Tarnas sort of played a similar role to the one that Hillman did
Got
within
you.
the Jungian milieu. Um, and so, but I think that there are a lot of really profound parallels between the work that Hillman and Tarnas are doing and the work of um, Deleuze and Guattari in particular, who have become, Deleuze I think has probably become my favorite philosopher in the last,
Okay.
you know, I don't know, 6 or 7 years or something like that.
Maybe that's a good pathway even into your book.
Yeah.
If we can really go there, what do you see as those connections between Tarnas and Hillman, and then Guattari and Deleuze? Like, unpack that a little bit. I know that's a lot, but that's where I'm getting really excited.
Right. Well, so I mean, so much of Jungian depth psychology is about looking at the the persons of the unconscious that were composed of these multiple personified potencies.
Mm,
That there's not this one true self, that uh, that's a fiction, and this is something James Hillman particularly emphasizes, but also Deleuze, he calls it a cogito for a dissolved self.
mm,
That this conception of a singular egoic consciousness is is they use this term biunivocal. It's dual, bi, and but univocal, one voiced. It's a biunivocal mirroring of the transcendental divinity of one exclusive Father God, basically.
mm.
And so I'm not against monotheism by any means, but what I'm against is the exclusive privileging of monotheism.
I am right there with you 100%. But and you know, before you go on, it's a really interesting thing, because I think even Hillman later in his career, he has this book called What is Archetypal Psychology, and he even, because he was so against monotheism and even Christianity, you know, people that knew him were like, wow, he maybe was a little bit too critical. And he even goes back and says, I might have been a little bit too harsh. He even says that, like,
Right.
you know, in my critique, maybe I fell into the same type of like monolithic, you know, perspective in terms of hating this so much. So I appreciate your comment that you're not trying to just completely shit on monotheism, but you're against just one way of looking at things.
Right, exactly. And that's actually that it's strikingly similar when he says that to I think what's sort of the one critique I have of Deleuze. I mean, you know, I think Deleuze is so profound and so resonant. A lot of people don't, first of all, a lot of people don't know that Deleuze was actually really influenced by Jung. Even Deleuzians, they
I didn't know
somehow
that. That was incredible. I love that part of your book.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, some people have done work on this before. Like Christian Karslake wrote, what is it, Deleuze and the Unconscious back in 2004. So that was a really pioneering work. And then there's a book called Deleuze and the Problematic Whole, which is a
Mm,
collection of essays edited by Roderick Mayne and his a couple of his associates. But even a lot of Deleuzians have sort of it's sometimes hard to tell if they somehow have blocked this out of their minds, or they just don't want to mention it, because
mm,
we know that Jung is you know he's he, Anthony Stevens, who wrote a book about Jung, he said that Jung has had a problematic relationship with academia because a lot of
yes.
his ideas are beyond the scientific pale.
Mm,
And Jung was, of course, he was Freud's
right.
right hand man. He was instrumental in the early development of
What was it? His
psychoanalysis.
prince or something like that? I forget exactly how Freud
Yeah,
referred to him.
Yeah, he called him his heir and son and heir, something something along those lines. I
Yeah.
mean, it was very explicit about it. And he was voted the president of the International Psychoanalytic Association for life, and he was the first editor of the Jahrbuch, the
Yes.
Journal of Psychoanalysis. So he was deeply enmeshed in the early development and promulgation of psychoanalysis. And then, of course, they went through this break, which, according to Jung, had a lot to do with Freud's dismissal of the occult. And
Mm,
but it's a complex issue, because Freud also affirmed, sort of ambiguously affirmed, telepathy later in his life. So it's a
right.
complex issue. And then so which we can get into, but Freud basically, he had a series of breaks
Mm,
with his students. I mean, he had a break with Sandor Ferenczi, and and so um, but he engaged in a campaign, basically a slander campaign against Jung after he excommunicated him, and he just basically said that Jung is crazy and went off the deep end. Um, and I mean, Jung did go through almost a decade of what he calls a schizophrenizing, where
mm,
he was doing a schizophrenia, is what he calls it, where he was going through this sort of semi-intentional um, basically it's what it I think we can describe it as now is a shamanic crisis, a prolonged
mm.
shamanic crisis, where he was um, and it's recorded in the Red Book, where
In the
he
Red
was
Book, right? Yeah.
yeah, where he was um, you know, encountering his unconscious
Yes.
through this process of active imagination. um, and this is what so many of his great concepts came out of this period. This was during, you know, during uh, the World War II, I think. Or was it? No, it was anyway. It was in the war, the war period there, when
Yes.
things were there was a lot of tumult in the world. Um, but um, so I
You well, so you I think I might have derailed you a little bit. You were gonna say something about after I mentioned Hillman's kind of coming back a little bit against his disdain for kind of monotheism, although I think he really still hated it.
Right.
You said that there's a similarity in maybe one critique you have of Deleuze, and
Right.
I don't
Yeah.
think you got into that. I was hoping you could kind of explore that.
Sure. Yeah. So indifference and repetition. I mean, he actually explicitly. I mean, so it's in like 8 or 9 texts where Deleuze explicitly discusses Jung, and in a lot of those texts, he's being being very complimentary about Jung and saying
Mm,
there's this one passage that I love in Jung, or so there's an endnote in Difference and Repetition where he says that this is the most profound aspect of Jung's thought, which is um, differentiating the unconscious. And so it gets pretty complex, but Deleuze has this concept of differentiation with a C as opposed to differentiation with a T, and
mm,
differentiation is a synonym of integration. So
mm.
that's the title of my book, is Integration and
Right.
Difference, and a lot of that is taken from it's sort of a riff on this concept of integrative differentiation from
Mm,
Deleuze. And so basically, what he does is what he says is that um, the central concern of this great work, Difference and Repetition, is deeply resonant with Jungian thought. And so this was in the late 60s, and even as late as the 80s, in interviews, he was still talking in glowing terms about Jung, although he also did critique him in some texts, especially with Guattari. So,
mm.
so that's interesting. He might have been influenced against Jung a bit by Guattari, who was more of he was a, a student of Lacan, who then sort of betrayed and rebelled against Lacan.
Gotcha. There's a lot of
But
rebelling going on in all of this.
it's true. It's sort of like the the father-son dialectic has been really
Seriously.
operative, especially I think in 20th century in 20th century philosophy and psychology. It's
Mm,
that's been a really dominant archetypal. It's the Oedipal relation.
yeah.
And so that's actually the thing that I was um, thinking is really similar to what you were talking about with Hillman, which
Mm,
is that, and his rejection of monotheism, which is that Deleuze is really rebelling against Hegel, and in particular, he's rebelling against this idea that 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 we can achieve. So just really briefly, we
please.
can we yeah. So Hegel has this idea that you have this original entity that becomes other than itself. Um, and then they exist in complex tension, and then eventually out of that tension emerges a reconciliation of opposites. And so, and if, that's Hegel's extremely complex, and he wrote a huge amount, and he's one of the most difficult, complex, subtle philosophers. But so that's like in a very small nutshell, Hegel. And so this is the primary mode of thought that Deleuze was rebelling against in Difference and Repetition. And he even says that there was almost a titanic father complex against Hegel at that moment in France in the 60s. That's
Mm,
sort of like Hegel is sort of the Catherine Malibu, who's a collaborator of Derrida's. She said that Hegel was the victim or something of the pack of the thinkers of difference of
wow.
Derrida and Deleuze. Um, and so, and Deleuze sort of variously acknowledges this. And then, of course, in the early 70s, in 1972, with his first book with Guattari, he wrote Anti-Oedipus, which is a book against the Oedipal complex
Mm,
in Freud, um, the dominance of the Oedipal complex, which is actually the probably the central issue that divided Jung and Freud. So and Zizek actually says that he states unequivocally that that Deleuze and Guattari inherited this rebellion against the Oedipal complex from Jung, and I think that's probably true, although there's no explicit
mm,
textual evidence that that's the case. But I think it's probably true. And then in Anti-Oedipus, they equate the Oedipal complex um, with the Hegelian dialectic. And
mm,
so they're rebelling against this. With Hegel, they're rebelling against this idea that these problematic oppositions can can be reconciled in perfect harmonious oneness, which they think of as a sort of, I think the French philosophers are understandably a little bit more skeptical about this return to wholeness and oneness
Okay.
than sort of Anglophone philosophers, precisely because they were I think it's historical because they were invaded by the Nazis,
Mm.
and that there's this, that's sort of the essence of the of fascist totalitarianism, is that everything is dominated by this one this
Yeah.
one way of being. And so I think they had a very direct, very visceral engagement with this. And there is a sense in which Nazism is descended from um, idealism, and I don't think that that's the only way to take, so Hegel and Kant, that I don't think that's the only direction that you can take
Right.
these German philosophers. But I think that that's the one aspect of Hegel, and I love Hegel, but I think that's the one aspect of his thought, the absolute, which
Mm.
I'm not interested in. Right? I agree with Deleuze's critique of Hegel, that and I think he goes a little too far. He's a little too harsh against
Mm.
Hegel. And I don't think Hegel would have advocated Nazism by any means, just to be
Sure.
clear.
Sure. Sure.
Um, but 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 this idea that that I mean, Deleuze talks about problems and questions as the motivating factor of being, and I think that's resonant with Hegel in a lot of ways. But I think Deleuze is also right that this idea that they can ever be reconciled in complete perfect wholeness and oneness is a dangerous and totalizing fantasy.
Yeah.
And I think Jung maybe tended to, he has the archetype of wholeness, right? And so, but I
Right.
think, so I think he tended to emphasize wholeness a bit. But I think especially in his engagements with alchemy and polytheism, he managed to not be um, quite as unambivalent in his that sort of totalizing return to wholeness as, for
Yes.
instance, Hegel was. So,
See, I couldn't agree more. This is okay. One of the big questions I wanted to ask you is I feel like, in the Twitter sphere and even in interviewing a lot of different people on my podcast, Jung tends to get shat on and a lot of people go to the kind of totalizing wholeness. But
mm,
and again, I'm not, a scholar, even an expert. A lot of my engagement with Jung came from my own kind of psychotherapy and just working with kind of the clinical side of things. I've never seen Jung as like this totalizing wholeness figure. I
mm,
actually, and I'm gonna just like almost get a tattoo of it. The chapter where you talk about Hillman, a disintegrated integration. That's how I've
yeah.
always read Jung, and maybe it's because in my kind of psychotherapy, I was reading Jung alongside Hillman, and so putting them together. But I don't know that I see Jung as that kind of monolithic type of person. I think I see him and interpret him in ways that you do as well. So I was really appreciative of that kind of interpretation that you brought about in the book.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, yeah. I mean, Jung said a lot of different things, and he
Yeah,
contradicted himself,
he
and he
really
wrote
did.
for like what, 5 or 6 decades. So
Yeah,
so
yeah,
and his thought developed in really profound ways over time. So for instance, the idea of the archetypes is often thought of as sort of these, just sort of a reiteration of the Platonic forms, these transcendent categories that everything can
right.
be crammed into. And I think you know he initially thought of the archetypes as um, these uh, instincts and sort of um, unconscious images that were developed through the process of evolution,
Of evolution, right.
and that they're primarily biological. And I don't think it was until later in his life and in his writing that he started to think of them more as, and this is something that Tarnas talks about, that he started to think of them more as um, uh, potencies, as dynamisms, and as powers and forces that structure reality itself. But I think a lot of Jungians take that sort of they read Jung in too simply, and I think he was always pushing against these sort of simplistic interpretations. And if you
Mm,
really read Jung, I mean, he has this huge seminar on Nietzsche's Zarathustra, for
right.
instance. I
Oh
mean, that's
yeah,
like, I
so
mean, it's like
good.
you can't fit Jung into these like simplistic categories that he's
No.
often, and it's like someone like I like I like Joseph Campbell in the sense that he brought he had some interesting ideas, and he brought Jung's ideas to a much broader audience.
Yeah,
But
he
I
was like a
do think
popularizer.
he's a popularizer. But I do think he had a tendency to sort of oversimplify some of Jung's ideas and really focus on this idea of the hero archetype, which
Mm,
um, it's for instance, it's one of Hillman's primary projects to problematize the dominance of that archetype, which
yes.
is, it's sort of resonant with with the ego.
Yeah. Can we
Um,
go there? Because that was one of the
yeah,
pathways I wanted to go down is, yeah, speak about how Hillman wanted to problematize the hero archetype.
yeah. Well, um, so so modernity has been constructed around this these hierarchical oppositions.
Mm,
That's I think the and it's not like modernity invented opposition, but it became the dominant narrative mode for constructing reality. So
yes.
we have um, it was this construction of the ego, this it was almost like an ossification of the ego was developed in order in by univocal relation with monotheism, in order to individuate the rational um, capacity of humanity. And so I
Mm,
think it was a really important and necessary development, for modernity to do that, to really emphasize egoic consciousness. But in order to do that, and this is something that Isabel Stengers is great on, in addition to these other thinkers that we're talking about, it was necessary to um, um, hierarchically repress and disqualify non-modern modes of thought.
mm,
Animism, polytheism, and I mean there were extended campaigns by by Enlightenment thinkers, for instance, to sort of expunge these modes of thought from uh, from the lexicon.
sure.
So, um, but so I think Jung was really a pioneer. I mean, Freudian psychology is it the purpose of Freudian psychology. I mean, it's very complex, and there's so many different nuances. But
Sure.
ultimately, I mean, which but ultimately the purpose of Freudian psychology is to strengthen the ego,
Yeah.
to and 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 Jung thought that this was not a healthy thing to do,
Mm,
because as he says, if you if you focus exclusively on egoic consciousness, you repress all these other aspects of the self, and those things, if you're not conscious of those unconscious persons of the psyche, because I think going back way before depth psychology, animism and polytheism were essentially ways of, or one register that they can be described in is that there are ways of expressing the multiplicity of the psyche, that
right.
we're not just this unified egoic self, that we have different conflicting contradictory impulses
Yes.
and desires. So, that one voice tells us to eat the extra cookie, or to,
Oh
to
yeah.
stay up
Or
and
two
watch
or three.
yeah, watch the extra episode and stay up a little later and not get enough sleep. And the other voice is telling us to go to bed and to not eat the cookie. And that's just, one drama among many. And
Yeah.
so often we're projecting these dramas onto others when it's really both of the figures in this we're talking about the father-son dialectic, this
Yes.
Oedipal dialectic, where you're rebelling against a father figure, and so often, um, you know, for I think young men especially, um, there's this tendency to identify with this puer figure, the young man, against the senex figure, which is the old man,
Yes.
um, and and I think individuation, and to project that old man figure onto a father or a mentor or a teacher, and to rebel against them. Um, and I think a large part of individuation, this is what Jung says, is to withdraw that projection and to
Mm,
see that senex figure is also part of our psyche, because we all
mm,
contain all of the archetypes within our psyches in
sure.
various relations and concentrations.
Man, I love that. And I know you were just getting there. That was another question I wanted to ask was could you speak to the necessity of projection in the individuation process, but then also the withdrawal and trying to become conscious of it within ourselves? That was just a great part of your book that I was hoping you could unpack a little bit more.
So this, I mean, this is something that Hillman is great on, and it's
Yes.
one of the in Freudian psychology, they call it transference, and for Freud, his answer to this is the analyst should just remain cold and detached and rational, and serve as a screen for projection and appeal to the rational ego of the patient. But Freud actually realized, he actually admitted around, I think it was in 1937, that this wasn't actually working, and this method wasn't producing a cure, and yet people have continued to engage in psychoanalysis, and even though the founder of psychoanalysis, I think, it admitted explicitly, and this, I'm writing a chapter on, it's a critique of psychoanalytic reason by
Mm,
Isabel Stengers and Leon Cherzak. I'm writing a book about Isabel Stengers right now, so I'm writing a
dude, I
chapter on
can't
this.
wait.
Oh, thank you.
I'm excited.
Thanks. But it's this great critique of psychoanalysis. Um, but uh, but what Jung, and I think others of Freud's followers also went off in different directions of this, like Ferenczi and Heinz Kohut,
Oh yeah.
separately from Jung, and Jung recognized that at an earlier stage of development, um, projection is healthy and normal. That a child it's in order to develop to individuate their own egoic sense of self, they need something, uh, you know, egoic self, which is this sort of lowercase self
Right.
of Jungian psychology, whereas the capital S self is the total psyche of conscious and unconscious. But
Yes.
the, they're individuating this, or differentiating is the word I should use, differentiating this egoic consciousness, um, by um, by finding an external figure to push against. But they're not seeing that person them for who they are. They're not seeing their parent for who they actually are. They're projecting this archetypal narrative onto them. I mean, not
Right.
always. I mean, it's, sometimes they can actually, it's not, I think that children really do love their parents for who they are on a profound level. Uh, Often that's the case, um, but as you mature and get older, um, you we often find other figures, whether it's a therapist. I mean, I think this probably happens a lot of time in
All the
therapy, where
time.
somebody projecting their their own, um, psychodrama, and I don't mean that in like a pejorative sense. It's
No, not at all.
their narratives, the psychological narratives that are, they have this repetition, this compulsion to repeat,
Sure.
because there's something there in the relation of these archetypal figures like the senex and puer, for instance, the father-son dialectic, that
Yes.
they're trying to, and we've all done this. I mean, I've done this, of course, um, that they need to learn and need to understand. And I think in that, with that particular dialectic, it's that we have to integrate the senex, which is maturity and wisdom and structure and caution, and it's old age and
Mm,
slowness and gravity, and but it's the negative. I mean,
yes.
it's the Hegelian negative. It's it's death and sadness and descent, and so this puer archetype is the Promethean archetype, which is um, it's discovery and inspiration and rebellion, and Prometheus discovered, or stole fire from the gods, and it's the revolution, and it's revelation. So
Yes.
it's sort of this very creative but ungrounded youthfulness, and
Mm,
this sort of heavy grounded, but you know in its more deficient, I think less healthy aspects, you know that senex archetype can cling and become controlling and rigid and ossified.
yes.
So it's like these are both necessary archetypes to living in a healthy way. And so when you're a child, of course you're going to identify more with the child archetype.
Right.
um, and so individuation is the withdrawal of that projection of that Saturnian senex archetype of, who's correlated with Kronos in Greek mythology and Saturn and Roman mythology, and and begin to experience that as internal to one's own psyche, rather
Mm,
than, because every, I think what I've learned, and heard from older people as well, as you get older, you never really lose that sense of being the child that you were. It's not
right.
like you come to just completely inhabit this senex archetype. I think a
Mm,
lot of, you know um, older people still feel like that hopeful, curious child that they
oh
were
yeah.
when they were small. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
Oh, Grant, man, such good stuff. Could we, so in engaging the Jung chapter and especially the Hillman chapter, it's interesting, right? You're into Stengers, and I think she has this book, Thinking with Whitehead. I was kind of thinking, I want to think with Grant Maxwell about someone like Jordan Peterson. I know when we first
Right.
connected, I kind of wanted you to maybe help me think about how Hillman's psychology, how your project could maybe address some of the things that he's talking about. Because just to be honest, as a male therapist who works almost exclusively with young men,
Mhm.
they bring him up every day, almost every
Really.
session. Yeah, they're really, a lot of these young men are really into his stuff, and I find it deeply problematic. So I'm always looking for, much smarter, well-read people to help me think through how to kind of address that. And I love Hillman, and so when you wrote this incredible chapter on Hillman, I was like, okay, I've got to figure out how I can kind of think through this with your help. So if you don't mind, what do you see problematic with someone like Peterson, and how do you begin to kind of conceptualize that?
Mhm. So there's something very archetypal happening with Peterson. He seems to be possessed by some kind of force, some kind of
Yeah.
archetypal force, and he's engaging in sort of this sort of extreme projection. So I think the main projections that he's engaging in are, one, he's got a lot of um, sort of complex, um, multifaceted arguments for this, but when it comes down to it, a lot of what he talks about is just advocating misogyny, that
Mm,
that that women should be a certain way, and that it's biologically determined, and men should be a certain way, and that's
yeah.
biologically determined. And I just I I just think that's not true.
I think it's
Just
bullshit.
it's complete bullshit. Um, and so there's that. So I think there's a lot of misogyny, and I think he gives men this sense of belonging. And
Mm,
I mean this idea that he's somehow this paragon of masculine toughness is absurd because he just starts, you know, the guy is a mess. I mean, he's
yeah,
psychological. I
he
mean, he's
is.
like,
He
I
is.
don't, he's gone through some, and that's fine. People can go through difficult things, but
Right.
um, he's sort of holding himself up as this sort of paragon of tough masculinity, and
Mm,
then he's just randomly weeping about things, which is fine. It's fine to cry, but it's very bizarre how much that clashes with what he actually says.
yes.
Um, so there's that. There's this very strange reification of gender roles, um,
Mm,
which, to be honest, Jung did have a tendency to reify these gender roles, although he was sometimes ambivalent about it,
right.
and it was problematic. And I think a lot of Jungians, particularly feminist Jungians,
Yes.
have called him out on that and have
Absolutely.
sort of revised
Sure.
revised these problematic tendencies in Jung's work, which I think in large part were a product of his time. But
Hmm.
he shouldn't be let off the hook that easily.
Sure. Sure.
Um, but so the other thing is that Peterson is really he's really into Jung, and
Right.
but he completely misreads Jung is the problem. And so he kind of sets up Jung as like sort of this counter theorist to what he terms um, postmodern neo-Marxism, which
Right.
isn't
Right.
really a thing that actually exists. It's
Right. I
just
was like,
this
what is that?
completely, yeah. I mean, so postmodernism, it's a term to describe, generally to describe French philosophy from the 60s and 70s, although people in francophone countries, French-speaking countries, I mean, as Stengers talks about this, that it's just not really a term that French people would really recognize. So it's sort of
Right.
like an American construction of French philosophy. Um,
Well
and it's
said.
sort of things. Yeah, I'm mostly paraphrasing Stengers here, but it's sort of lumps together very different
Mm,
philosophers and psychologists like Lacan. So
right.
it lumps together Lacan with Derrida, with Deleuze, and these people, a lot of them had really sharp, profound disagreements with each
Mm,
other. Um, and so, I think, in a sense, there's some similarities between these thinkers that has a lot to do with um, the fact that they're all French and they were all thinking about a lot of the same philosophers. So a lot of them were and psychologists. So a lot of them were thinking about Freud. Probably the triumvirate is Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche. Those were like
mm,
probably the three primary influences on what sort of vaguely be called post-structuralism.
sure.
But this idea that there's this thing called postmodern neo-Marxism is just absurd, and it's like uh, this idea that, for instance, Derrida could be called a Marxist. It's not really. I mean, he wrote a book sort of about Marxism. It's like Specters of Marx, but it's not really about Marxism. It's about something else entirely. um, and he had this debate with Zizek, who
Yeah.
I'm not a huge fan of Zizek either. I think he can get a little bit reactionary sometimes,
Mm,
or just over like I think he's turned into a caricature of himself.
mm,
He's a brilliant guy, but he's sort of like this cartoon character who's this sort of Hegelian Marxist Lacanian
right. Right.
who he's just, I think at this point, and what I the way I felt about that big sort of highly publicized debate between Zizek and Peterson is that he was primarily doing it to sell books, and he was just trying to be provocative.
Got you.
And I thought that actually Peterson came off as much more polished, and Zizek,
Mm,
although what Zizek was actually saying was much more profound.
yeah. Yeah.
But so, but just to return to Peterson's issue with Jung, he, so I read, maybe like the introduction and like the first chapter of Peterson's first book, Maps of Meaning, which is sort
Yes.
of his more academic book before he came out with the
The 12 rules for life
12 Rules for
and all,
Life.
and yeah.
Yeah. Um, and it's his interpretation of Jung is just not correct.
Mm.
And it's actually bizarrely backwards. And his interpretation is that the that the ego has to the slay the dragon of the feminine chaos, the unconscious chaos, that it has to be slain by the heroic ego. And
Mm.
this is actually much closer to Freud, actually. um, this is the opposite of what Jung says, because Jung is saying that when he's talking about this alchemical symbolism of the dragon
Yeah.
that must be slain in order to win the treasure hard to attain, which is the alchemical opus. Um, it's the when the 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 dragon that has to be slain is the shadow of the ego. It's
Mm.
the ego itself. It's that book, the ego and its own. It's the negative aspect of egoic consciousness. So it's the ego that has to be slain in order to allow the to resituate egoic consciousness. So we're not. He's not. Jung isn't advocating doing away with ego completely, because we would be completely unconscious. We wouldn't be able to
Right.
function in the world. We would
Right.
be essentially non-human animals. Which I love non-human animals, but I don't. I enjoy having a conscious, rational
Me
capacity.
too.
So it's so we were talking about the exclusive dominance of monotheism. It's the exclusivist dominance of egoic consciousness
Mm.
mirroring the exclusive dominance of this monotheistic narrative, at the expense of the repression of all of the other voices and the archetypal persons of the unconscious that were
Yes.
repressed in the unconscious. I mean, if you go back to to polytheism, I think there's a strong case to be made that I mean, the ego was much weaker, and that um, people experience themselves as a plurality of voices. And so I think a lot of that was they were hearing the gods speak to them, or they were communing with the spirits of nature in
Sure.
animism. Um, and but there's I think there's a profound um, psychological truth in those modes of thought, in those non-modern modes of thought, and so I think that's what Jung and Hillman are advocating a return to, is the death and rebirth of the ego in a more resituating the ego in a more democratic
Mm.
multiplicity of voices, as a first among equals, rather than as a totalitarian dictator who's repressing the other persons of the unconscious.
Oh, that's so good. And see, this is
It
where I
is.
think it's interesting that he's had this recent interest. He's done these series on Genesis and I think now Exodus. I
Mm.
I don't know that he's consciously linking all this, but I feel like he's kind of returning to kind of a monotheism, and then that reflects, I think, some of his psychology or reinforces it in a way that's so against kind of the Hillman approach that you're talking about, kind of the polytheistic psyche and a first among equals, which I love. I mean, that's exactly where I'm at.
Yeah, I mean, it's like he has all these. Basically, he goes through all of these arguments for why hierarchy, hierarchy in social class is good and
Right.
natural. Why gender hierarchy, men over women, is good. Why you know gender, sexuality, hierarchy in sexuality is good. Uh, and why capitalism is inherently the best, the best um, economic structure. I mean, he really demonizes, for instance, communism.
Mm,
And there's always like a grain of truth in what he says,
of course.
which is why it's plausible. I mean,
Yes.
often there's not always a grain of truth, but there's often a grain of truth. So he
Sure.
says, well, a lot of people like have been murdered under communist totalitarianism, and so therefore capitalism is good. That's basically
Yeah.
like the essence of his um his argument. And so, and I think, we could deepen that to see that that any ideology, when pushed to when elevated and privileged exclusively by the denouncement and repression and rejection and disqualification of other modes of relation, um, becomes totalitarian
Oh
and
yeah.
fascistic.
Sure.
Um, so it's I mean so it's I think you can see that with the fascism of the Nazis, but you can also see that with the communism of the Soviets. And I think honestly, I think that the Republican Party, especially under Trump right now, is really they want to create a capitalist totalitarianism, a Christian
Mm,
capitalist totalitarianism. And so I think that's one thing that Deleuze and Guattari are so good about is you know they're the theorists against not only fascism on a global historical political scale, but also against micro-fascisms. And
yeah.
that's where it starts. It starts in in passive aggression, and
Mm,
in the small meannesses and cruelties of just our daily interactions. And they call that those micro fascisms. And you have to expunge these micro fascisms from and it's hard to do that because a lot of us, everyone has defense mechanisms. And so
right.
some when we're stressed or or unhappy, we have a tendency to act out and to be not as nice, and to we can be overly critical or negative um, or mean or sabotaging or undermining. So
Sure.
I think there's um, I was just thinking about this. It's like how do we overcome this fundamental issue that's sort of polarizing our country and tearing our country apart right now, which is um, between this sort of um, totalitarian fascistic mode, which I think Peterson, honestly, I think he's allied with that Trumpian mode. Trump is sort of the most populist
Yeah.
version of that, and I think Peterson is sort of the most sophisticated
Mm.
version of that. But I think they're going in the same
No, I
direction.
agree,
He's
100%.
um, and so how do we overcome this? And I was just thinking about this in terms of this philosopher Stephen Shaviro, who I really admire.
I
He wrote
saw that
this,
tweet. I loved it. Yeah,
yeah.
please go there, man.
Actually just saw this. I think it was this morning. I
Mm,
saw that he posted something on Facebook. So he's a scholar of Whitehead, and he's into
okay.
Deleuze and Guattari, and brilliant guy. Wrote this book called Without Criteria that I talk about in my book. He's a professor at Wayne State University, and he posted a Facebook post a couple days ago where he said that it would be admirable to kill to kill racists, homophobes, and transphobes. And I was thinking, how does someone get? First of all, I deeply disagree with that.
Same here.
I think that violence violence reifies opposition.
Oh
It just
yeah,
creates a cycle of violence and anger and retribution. Um,
absolutely.
and so, but I was thinking, how does someone that I admire deeply and who's a brilliant thinker get to that point where he's advocating something so extreme and to me morally reprehensible? Um, and, and so I don't know what's going on with Stephen psychologically at this moment, and I hope he's, honestly, I hope he's okay, because that
Sure.
seems like there might be something, uh, he might be having some mental health issues or something like
Sure.
that. Um, but I think in any oppositional situation like this, where there's this sort of rigid oppositionality and conflict, it's you see this in the Middle East,
Mm,
and you see this in Israel and Palestine. How do you overcome this anger and this cycle of anger and violence? And I think what it comes down to is that one of the parties in this opposition has to step back from the conflict and and uh, use various tactics and strategies to try and redirect the opposition and conflict, and to dissolve it, and to let it circulate in wider assemblages. So
absolutely.
it's a hard thing to do. I mean,
Very
I'm sure
difficult.
when you're dealing with someone who just wants to fight you, what do
Mm,
you do with that? It's very hard to just to step back and to sort of try to make peace with that person, and to find a way to to take this opposition and to expand it into more, you know, more topologically complex sort of narrative construction. Um,
absolutely.
and I think what I was thinking about is one of the ways to do that is, yes, we should advocate politically, protest and vote and write books about politics, and um, things on, run for office and things of that nature. But I think what we can all do in our daily lives is to try to become conscious of these microaggressions and
Mm,
these microfascisms and
microfascisms. Yeah.
these defense mechanisms, that make us, and you see this so often on the left. You see people who I agree with all of their politics, um, but they're just assholes,
They're just
and they're
assholes. Yeah.
um,
100%.
and they're just, it's like sort of they create this in crowd mentality where um, it's more about gaining prestige among their peers on the left than actually advancing the goals of the left, which
Couldn't
is,
agree
which
more.
I see as, compassion and fairness and equity and peace
Right.
and justice, and you know um, and so it's but so it's like what Nietzsche said about, um, you know people who are fighting against monsters should be careful that they don't become monsters themselves. And I think
Mm,
that's something that people on the left could really benefit from, because my views are extremely, I mean, they're pretty radical. Like I guess I'm a market socialist, but I think that we should have, universal basic income, a free education. I think we could do all of these things by just taxing billionaires at a reasonable rate. And we can get into that whole political
yeah.
and
Yeah.
economic conversation too. But
But wherever you are, it sounds to me you don't want to be violent or an asshole.
right, yeah, it can be hard to not be an asshole, especially
Yes.
especially especially under I think under a capitalist system that's becoming more and more difficult for, because we're concentrating more and more wealth, um, with the people at the top, and so there's less and less for everyone else,
It's
and
awful.
that, this is something I'm thinking about in terms of therapy and psychology practice. It's like,
Yes.
how do you deal with this situation that the number one probably stress for people who are in therapy is money issues, right? I mean,
This is why I was talking to a good friend yesterday that when recently, after the tragic shootings, people on the right have been talking, and I think some people on the left would even say the same thing, that, oh, it's ultimately about mental health. that they're not considering what you just said, that mental health, I think, is so rooted in these larger economic and social ills. James Hillman, one of my favorite books that he kind of co-wrote with Michael Ventura, who was this LA essayist.
Yeah.
We've had 100 years of psychotherapy and we're getting worse, which is a phenomenal title. He says we don't just have sick souls, we have a sick society.
Yeah.
And so what you just said just deeply resonates with me. I unfortunately don't have an answer though. I'm trying to work on it. When I work with these men, I try to make it very clear that, you're not the problem. It's not just inside your skull. You're connected to these larger realities that, lead to these ills that you're facing. And I try to do my part. I don't take insurance. I'm in private practice, which gives me the freedom to talk about Hillman and Hegel and all this stuff with my clients. But I always try to see people for free if I can. I try to do my part in terms of creating space for those that can't afford it, because my therapy is expensive. But that's a whole nother issue with that's a whole other issue with insurance. Is sometimes
Yeah.
those that are on insurance, their hands are tied in terms of the type of therapy they can do. They can only do kind of cognitive behavioral therapy or other things the insurance companies deem, valid. And
Right.
it doesn't seem to be that effective. But yeah, so I don't have any answers, but I think the question you just posed is one that torments me as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think I think I was much more hopeful about, you know, the relatively sudden emergence of a novel epoch,
Mm,
on a collective scale, that there might be this sort of moment um, of relatively sudden transformation. We would reach this tipping point, and all of a sudden we would be in this new era. Um, I think I've come become. I still think that we're on the cusp of a novel narrative epical construction, but I think this cusp is like a multi-generational cusp. I think
got you.
it's a moment of transition lasting several generations, and it's been,
Sure.
I think our parents and even grandparents were sort of the forerunners of this, and we, so but I think what we can do, this is the sort of the conclusion that I've come to, is that we've got, we're talking about capitalism, climate change, is
Right.
they're so intertwined, and it's such a huge problem. And it's like, you can really just feel helpless in the face of these, you know, just fundamental global problems.
Yes.
And so I think, all we can do individually um, is to take every relation that we have with others and to take every opportunity and try to bring as much awareness to it as we can, and
Mm,
to try to be as um, generative and positive, and you know um, to lift others up. And that, I mean, that's it's not always an easy thing to do, because we're all going through moments of stress and difficulty at various
sure.
times.
Dude, but I
um,
couldn't agree more. I love that hopeful vision. So, man, I feel bad. I do have to step off because I'm going to see a client in a little
yeah,
bit.
yeah.
But I really wanted to get into Stangers and ask you about Whitehead. I wonder if we can still keep maybe the appointment next week and do a second episode. Would you be open to that?
Sure, yeah, let's talk about it, yeah, for
Okay.
sure.
Okay. So, would you mind just ending with the line of the podcast, which is continue the conversation?
I like that. Let's continue the conversation.